who am I? Who am I now?
It's an age-old question, and the answer is written in the stars.
This is the beautiful thing about having a map of the heavens that is yours for your entire lifetime, and you get to check in with it.
Heidi Rose Robbins, celebrated poet and astrologer, takes us on a journey to understand our celestial roots.
There's always these energetic overlaps, and that alone is fascinating even for the greatest astrology skeptic.
And she's helping us map out a forecast for our future.
Astrology is like weather. Yeah, you know the weather. How do you choose to meet it? Are you going to buy an umbrella and a raincoat, or are you going to run out like a wild thing naked? I mean, you get to choose, you know?
On an all-new Intentional Living with Courtney Meyers. Welcome to Intentional Living with Courtney Meyers, a podcast dedicated to those seeking a more fulfilled and purposeful life through thought-provoking conversation, spiritual exploration, and authentic connections. The intentional movement has begun, and if you found yourself here, you are a part of it. Intentional Living with Courtney Meyers starts now. Hi, Heidi. Welcome to Intentional Living with Courtney Meyers. It's such an honor and a pleasure to have you join me today.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here with you.
It's really a treat to get to talk to you because you're doing something in the world that is really unique I think, is bringing the whole idea of astrology together with your writing and your poetry. And these are combining two such seemingly different spaces together. And it's a beautiful connection to yourself and your soul. And I think it's really one that needs to be explored of, connecting to who we truly are from within. Because I always talk about writing being kind of the gateway to your heart and the gateway to your inner self. But then when it brings astrology in, which I don't know a ton about, and I'm extremely interested in, astrology feels like it's just a map to who we truly are. So bringing in this map to who we are with this expression of self, how does that all work together?
Thank you for that question. And I love to talk about astrology and poetry together. And I don't often get to unless I'm the one generating it, but I do feel that they're both gorgeous modalities to get to the heart of who we are. And so I even think about, how a poem is on a page and there's all this beautiful white space around it, there's all kinds of possibility around the poem and you've chosen these specific words to live into. I sort of feel the same way about a chart. Here's this beautiful astrological chart of the moment you were born, and all around the edges of it are, how are you going to use this energy? How are you going to cultivate this energy? How are you going to make the most of this map of the moment you were born? So, I've always been an artist and I grew up around astrology. My father was an astrologer. So they're languages that I grew up around. And the way that I like to combine them now is when I read a poem, I like to think about, who does this speak to? Is this a poem about an Aries? Is this a poem about a Taurus? Is this a poem that speaks to the growth of a Scorpio? So I like to sort of play in that territory. But I also just like to use both modalities to get to that tender part of ourselves that says, this is who I am. This is what I want to say in the world. And I want to use both of those modalities to help us say it.
So how do we do that? I mean, how do we get that courage to say who we are through our writing? And how do we use astrology to help us get there?
Well, let's break it down. With, astrology, there's a beautiful map, a two-dimensional picture of the moment you were born. And in the astrology I practice, one of the most important positions that many people don't know is their rising sign. So it's the sign that was at the horizon the moment they took their first breath. It's different than the sun sign. So we're all going around saying, I'm an Aries, I'm a Taurus, but this is a different position. And the rising sign has a lot to do with what is rising in us and what we're cultivating. And so when you start to know your rising sign, you start to say to yourself, what is my soul's purpose? What am I here to talk about? What am I here to do? And that can really help when you are studying, when you're using astrology to support what it is you want to say and how you want to say it. And so when I meet with clients, I'm definitely pointing out these superpowers that people have available to them in their charts and giving them courage to explore these different areas. So it's sort of like holding up a mirror and saying, this is who you are. You know, that's the beauty of an astrological chart. Of course, it's not at all fatalistic. I'm not saying this is going to happen to you and this is who you're definitely going to become. It's also about your free will and how do you meet these energies? Are you going to work with them or not? You know? And then, Courtney, if I were going to go over to poetry, I would say I love to gift people poems, and I love to say, I see you in this, or I think this poem speaks to this moment in your life. I hope it gives you courage. I hope it gives you solace. You know, I hope it gives you inspiration. So I like to see a person in a poem and give it to them as a soul gift.
That's beautiful. And even though when you're talking about the astrology aspect of it, because that is something that I've been told, you know, it is kind of like a map to who you truly are. But like everything, we do have free will. When we're talking about anything spiritual, I think a lot of times we get really stuck on I know I have on this should happen, or this is the way it's supposed to be. You know, this is the path you're going to take. I mean, for the longest time, all I wanted to do was touch base with psychics to like, how is my life? It's that control. How is my life going to play out? And even my mentor, who's very big in the spiritual space, she's talked to me as like astrology being something good for me to give me kind of the outline and frame of to understand who I am. Now, what is really interesting is once I started to really look into it, because I did what most people do when it comes to astrology. You know, you just look at your magazine as a kid or whatever, and I'm this and your birthday, and it falls in. And that is just like so not accurate for the longest time up until just a couple months ago. I said I was a Pisces. Well, I was a Pisces on the cusp. I'm not a Pisces. I had my chart done. I'm an Aries. Like, and I've taken the parts of my Pisces self and given myself the narrative for my life as a Pisces.
Wow.
It's totally wrong.
Well, and, you know, it's possible also, Courtney, that if you have planets in Pisces, like your Mercury might be in Pisces or Venus might be in Pisces. So there might be qualities that you relate to in the Pisces energy. But yes, for people born right at that cusp, it is so important to know your exact time of birth, because on a given day, you know, the sun can be in Pisces and then it moves into Aries, right? And I mean, I feel you already. You're very you have a fire to you. And Aries says, you know what? I want to do this. I'm doing it. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm running my own business. I'm diving in. You know, it's got a lot of the energy of springtime. And so it's so important that you know you're a Pisces. Absolutely.
I mean, once I found out that I was actually Aries, not Pisces, I think I watched a clip of Deborah Silverman acting out the different like signs or you know, and she did the Aries, and my husband and I watched it together and we were just laughing. I'm like, oh my goodness, that's me. And boy, are Aries obnoxious. Like I can be like intense and obnoxious. I'm like, wait a minute, do I really want to be this? But how much does that sign truly say about us?
Well, so every sign has a beautiful trajectory, and you can have the quote unquote obnoxious Aries, or you can have the ones that are very impatient or impulsive or, you know, headstrong, but that is not the deepest truth of the sign. The deepest truth of the sign is that Aries are here as forerunners. They are here with bold ideas. They are here to plant seeds in humanity to say, this is possible. We can do this. Let's think of the new and not cling to the old. And so Aries are thought leaders, and every person can evolve through their sign. So you might meet an Aries who's deeply worked on themselves or understands the energy of impatience and has chosen to integrate more of Libra, which is the sign opposite, you know? So in order to bring balance, you always want to integrate the sign. One of the things you can do is integrate the sign opposite. So Aries always wants to learn from Libra because Libra is more graceful. Libra has more of the ability to pause and reflect. Libra likes to collaborate where Aries is solo, so they learn from one another and you can evolve to a higher point through learning from the opposite.
I actually think Libra is my rising.
Okay, that's a beautiful thing if that's the case, because it means that you have a built-in energy of that balance. It's like, yes, you're an Aries, but in the astrology I practice, you are actually here for the energy of Libra. And guess what? Libra rules the beautiful conversation. Libra rules the interview. Libra rules the conversation that plants new seeds for people in their lives. And that's what you're doing with this podcast.
Wow. So how does that work with you? Like, what is the sign of a poet or a writer? Because I am a writer as well. I've been writing my whole life. I'm a ghostwriter. I have my own books. Like, I've been writing in television. You're a poet. So like, what is it, the sign that brings out the words in you and that creativity?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's so nice to talk about. I'm an Aries as well, Courtney. We're both Aries, but it's a very important thing in the chart if you're a writer where your Mercury is, okay? Because Mercury is the planet of writing and communication. My Mercury is in the sign of Pisces, which rules poetry and it rules music and it rules sensitivity. So even though Aries can sometimes be really like, really full on, a Mercury and Pisces person is going to be much more intuitive, is going to be much more of a listener, is going to be much more of a receiver. And that's where my poetry comes in my astrological chart. So even though I've got a lot of fire, this Mercury placement says, but my greatest joy when it comes to writing or to communicating with another is to be much more flowing and fluid and intuitive and to tap into a connection with love or God or vastness or, all that is.
But your poetry does. Your poetry has a fire behind it. I know you've talked about being a revolutionary through your poetry, which I think is beautiful. And I mean, your poetry takes on an aspect of almost like spoken word.
Thank you. Yeah. I went through a phase. I mean, how many years ago was it now? I want to say like maybe even 7 years ago, there was a moment when I was thinking about myself as an astrologer. I've been an astrologer for almost 25 years. And I was thinking about my poetry self. And I said, what if I never practiced astrology again? I was just like, thinking about my life. And I said, what if I led with poetry? And I called myself at that point, I decided to name myself a poet with the map of the heavens in my pocket. That's what I called myself. But at that moment, I had been writing poetry in a certain way. And then something came through and it coincided with a transit in my chart. And a transit is simply when the planets in the heavens line up with your birth chart and activate it, right? So the planet Uranus, which is the god of the earthquake, which is the god of excitement, which is the god of improvisation, was lined up with my Aries sun. And it woke it up and it shook it up. And suddenly my poetry had a more of a spoken word quality. And it came, I would say for a number of years, it had more of a spoken word quality. And I always think it's so much better to read poetry aloud. And so always, I suppose in that regard, my poetry is a spoken word quality. Like I want you to say it out loud. I want to read it out loud. I think it lands differently when it's shared that way.
Well, I think that it lands differently when it's shared that way, especially by the author. I mean, as a writer, when I'm writing, I read what I write out loud to see how it lands because it's our inflection. It's what we mean. And so it takes on a new meaning when the writer actually takes charge of it. I'm even, I'm teaching, I teach others of how to connect to who they are inside so that they can write from the heart, because I think that is where our writing affects the most people. It lands the most. It's like we can use our words. We can say what we want in our head. We can work things to sound cool and fun. And I've done that for my majority of my career. I wrote promos for television for shows. I could wordsmith anything to make it sound snappy, but it's in that real writing when you can connect to who you are within is where you really can evoke change or connect with someone. And that's what I love, the idea that you are bringing these two things together that seem so seemingly different. The astrology, the science, and the art, bringing it together allows you to really fully embrace who you are. And I feel that astrology really lets us in on our inner workings. And so if we can understand that, then we can express ourselves through our writing or our words in such a more authentic way.
Yeah, that's well said. I think part of it for me is I am a Leo rising, and Leo is always asking, who am I? Who am I now? And so astrology goes a long way to help answer that question. And so once my father used to say, if you know who you are, you'll know what to do. And so, this feeling of, oh, I'm naming myself something new, which gives me permission to show up on the page in a whole new way, So I do think there's something empowering about knowing the parts of yourself, growing the parts of yourself, and then showing up on the page in those different parts. A lot of times I lead retreats for many, many years now. And a lot of times I'll have people write from the perspective of one of the planets in their chart. So, for example, if I were writing from the perspective of my Venus in Taurus, I might write to myself from that position. So I might say, oh, sweetheart, I have so much beauty to offer you. I am lush and grounded and flowering, and I want to give you a sense of pleasure and stability, so I'm actually getting people to write a part of themselves, and it's so deeply nourishing.
So does does astrology help us acknowledge those parts of ourselves that might have gone unnoticed once we start to tap into it?
Yes. And that's why so many times in the middle of a session, somebody will break into tears because I've named something in a person that has been buried, that they know is there, but they haven't given themselves permission to access or express or name. And so if you go around the chart, there are all these characters. There's this cast of characters. And if I can speak to a character that has been a bit more hidden, there's relief, there's truth telling, there's a greater flow. And so absolutely astrology can help you name parts of yourself that you have kept at bay.
Is that how we allow ourselves to change? Because why do we ignore these parts of ourselves? They're there. Why do we shut them off?
We're scared. We early in life, somebody squashed us in a particular expression of the planet. We danced into the living room and somebody dismissed it. Or we had a scary experience when we showed that part of ourselves, and then we just hid, right? Or we don't feel deserving, or we don't feel valuable, or we fear rejection. There are 1,000 reasons why we don't live into the fullness of ourselves. And I had a teacher, or I should say I have a teacher who, she speaks of this idea of outshining our closures, So in other words, we just have to we don't have to fix ourselves. We just have to keep growing the light that we know and have experienced. And as we grow that light, those little parts of ourselves that have been hiding come out of hiding, or or those little parts of ourselves that have been irritating us, they just disappear. They just because we're walking in our light. We're walking as light, and we're freeing up these other parts of ourselves.
It's just interesting to me because if they are so innate, if we are born with these aspects of self, I just don't understand how we can go about life not expressing them. Because if they are part of us, it's going to come out in some way, shape, or form, isn't it? If you ignore it long enough, like it's going to show itself, or something in the universe is going to cause you to look at it or embrace it or open yourself up to it. Is that not accurate?
No, it's accurate. I mean, I would just say this. It will show up, but the question is, at what level of consciousness? So, you could be a certain planet in a certain position could be showing up in its less beautiful way. It could be, you could feel controlling, or you could feel inhibited. It could be showing up, but there's a whole nother way it could show up if you add love and acceptance and compassion to that point, And by the way, I do think that astrology is one of the greatest tools of compassion, because when we can look at ourselves and see some of what we're having to deal with, not everything is easy in the chart by any means. There's a lot of difficulty, in the charts, right? So when you can look at ourselves and say, oh my gosh, look at what you have done working with this energy. And then when we can look out in the world and say, oh my goodness, that person is a blah, blah sun, blah, blah moon, this rising sign, and look what they've had to work with. Suddenly there's a whole new level of compassion that comes in.
Well, it sounds like there's a level of duality in the astrological chart. There, like you said, there's like some signs, there's a negative, not even negative, just like not as loving aspect. And then there's that, there's a more difficult aspect and a more loving aspect of every sign.
Yeah, just like us. Yes. I mean, absolutely. Every sign I've always said this with my students, every sign has its wretchedness, and every sign has its beautiful highest evolution. And we are here. Our job is to evolve the energy so that we can use it in greater love, in greater consciousness, so that we can give it as a gift to help others. Instead of obsess about our brokenness or obsess about, our own needs. And so the moment that you start to turn outward and say, how can I help you? How can I help you? That the energy gets to be used in an entirely different way.
Yeah. Well, now with the raising, with consciousness raising across the globe, pretty much across the world, it really, there is this consciousness shift, I feel, that's happening. Do you see astrologically, is there like a group astrological energy?
Yes. At any given moment in the heavens, you can always look at where the planets are in relationship to one another, right? Completely outside of our little selves. What is the relationship? So for example, in the late 60s, Pluto and Uranus were sitting next to each other. This is very rare. This wouldn't happen for hundreds of years again. It's very rare. And they're sitting next to each other in the sign of Virgo. And Pluto is the planet of death and rebirth and power and misuse of power. And Uranus is the planet of revolution. So what did we have? We had these huge revolutions, sex, drugs, rock and roll, power to the people. We had the civil rights movement. We had, all this incredible progressivism and activism. All right. So that happened. Guess what? Just a few years ago, those two planets were squaring one another. So for the first time, since the late 60s, they were in this another angle that was we have got to rise as a people and, save our democracy and speak out. And so again, probably for the first time since the 60s, all these marches, all these, rallying to come together to kind of protect what is progressing, right? So, yes, there is a much larger design that's completely outside of the individual.
So what do you see happening now?
Well, right now, for example, there's a lot going on, but one of the things that's really fascinating is that Pluto, again, this planet of power and this planet of wealth and this planet of death and rebirth, which takes 248 years to go around the chart, okay, is about to move into Aquarius. And in fact, it already dipped into Aquarius. The last time it was there was during the American Revolution. And
Wow.
Aquarius is the sign of democracy. It's the sign that rules technology. So the minute Pluto touched Aquarius just in this last year was when everything broke through around AI. Did you notice that moment when suddenly chat
Yeah.
box and blah, blah, blah? Like the moment it touched in, it was like, oh my gosh, like this is going to get ahead of us if we're not careful. And there's going to be a lot that has to be outed in the realm of technology and in the realm of the whole online world that's going to have to be cleaned up and managed and all of that. And then, of course, everything that's going on with our democracy, that's Pluto and Aquarius too. And Pluto will spend 15 years in the sign of Aquarius. So we're on a long journey around this death and rebirth and using power well. And so we're at a huge moment as humanity, around a deepening and empowering around technology, around, it's obvious we're in a huge moment of duality, and it's like, what's going to win here? And Pluto and Aquarius is going to have a lot to say as it progresses.
So we can't necessarily like predict what's going to happen or where we're going. We just know it's almost like the forecast for what could happen. I mean, like I told you before we jumped on, I just moved from Southern California to Tennessee, and I've learned about weather that I never knew about. Southern California, my whole entire life, you don't get weather. Here, I'm like, wow, they can predict exactly where that tornado is going to hit. And it's been really fascinating because they can look at the conditions, the different aspects of all these different natural circumstances coming together, and they can tell you if something's going to hit. So that's kind of like what astrology is doing. It's bringing in these different energies together and like, this is ripe for a revolution.
Yes. And so, for example, in your own chart, you said you moved a year ago. Is that right? Or
about
in the
a year
last
and a half ago. About a year and a half ago. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So about a year ago, Jupiter entered the sign of Aries. That is a time of great growth. That is a time that only happens once every 12 years. That if you were looking at your chart and you were like, oh my gosh, Jupiter's entering Aries, that's my own sign. This is a time when I am really meant to outgrow an old self. This is a time when I'm meant to take a bold, brave step and change my life. And my life is meant to expand now. And so just about a year ago, in fact, a little bit over a year ago, interestingly enough, a year and several months ago, Jupiter moved into Aries. So if I were looking at that and I hadn't made plans to move, I would say to myself, I've got to use this in some way. Is it time to move? Is it time that I'm promoted? Is it time that I should apply for this job? So this is how you meet the chart without it being like, this is what's going to happen to you.
Wow. So how does that work? I mean, that I fell into the chart. I mean, obviously my energies were matching up because like literally it was a change of life. It wasn't just a move. It was everything about my life changed, and bigger growth, more consciousness, like everything you were saying is like, wow.
Yeah. I mean, even I'm just quickly, like I'm looking at the chart for you and I'm like reminding myself what month Jupiter moved in. And guess what? I don't know how this lines up for you, but it was in May of 22 that Jupiter entered Aries. So that was basically a year and a half ago.
We moved April, I think April 11th.
Okay. So you moved right at the end, and Aries is the fresh start. Aries is the new beginning, so yeah, I mean, how do you use this? This is the beautiful thing about like having a map of the heavens that is yours for your entire lifetime, and you get to check in with it, and you get to, it's like somebody sits down with you and says, over this next year, here are the possibilities. You get to choose this, you get to choose that. Sometimes we don't get to choose, of course, some things happen, but how do you want to meet that? Like, you know the weather that's coming up. Astrology is like weather. Yeah, you know the weather. How do you choose to meet it? Are you going to buy an umbrella and a raincoat, or are you going to like run out like a wild thing naked? I mean, you get to choose,
Well, Well, so like, how does this work? Because I mean, I think there are certain aspects of astrology that get tossed around a lot. Oh, it's Mercury retrograde, or it's this or that. You know, people tap into these little things. And I know that they affect us, but like, how does it, I mean, how do we use it like on a more, I guess you've already explained this, on like a more in-depth level? Because you know, I feel like we're constantly in Mercury retrograde. And so everyone just uses that as an excuse, like, whatever, my life's going to shit right now.
Yeah, you never want to use astrology as an excuse. And also Mercury retrograde, people forget that it's actually a beautiful reflective time. And it's a time when we're meant to pause and breathe before we go out again, like just continue to drill away. It's these built-in 3 times a year, a built-in reflection time. That's what it's about. And so you actually want to use that for a reflection time instead of trying to bust through and keep going. You want to pause. So, the best way to use astrology is first to know your astrological chart, or even to start, even your sun, moon, and rising sign. And particularly if you're a mama, to know your children's astrology so that you can help guide them, so that you can see where they need, extra encouragement or what they're trying to express. And one of the things that my team and I do over the last, now 5 years, is that we offer a sun, moon, and rising snapshot that you can order. And it's an audio of 15 minutes where an astrologer is describing your sun, moon, and rising and what houses each of those are in, and gives you just a beginning. So of course you want to understand this gift that you were given the moment you were born. And then the other way to work with it is to actually know what we call the transits, like what is happening in the greater cosmos and how is that lining up with your chart and how can you meet it?
So how does this work with like the divine, because when we come in as children, we're choosing our parents, we're choosing our life, we're choosing the time that we want to incarnate in this life, all these different aspects of spirituality coming in as a person, as a human, having this experience. So are we choosing this astrological sign, or is it choosing us, or is it just kind of like all part of the big human design?
Yeah. Now, of course we don't know for sure, but my current understanding or the way that I think about it is that, yes, we are souls on a very long journey, and reincarnation is a fact, and we are choosing our next lifetime in which to continue our evolution. And we hopefully, I think a soul chooses a moment that says, I need to continue working on growing the Leo rising, or I need to continue working to, grow a particular part of the chart. So when you think about C-sections and when you think about that kind of thing, obviously it's not going to always be, you're not going to be like, I will be born at 1:52 p.m. It's more of if one or two things are in place, you're making that choice. So, it'll be fascinating someday when we actually understand all the mechanics of it. But I do believe we reincarnate in groups. I do believe, we work out our karma with one another. I do believe we choose certain things about the moment we were born, and we take on certain aspects in the chart to keep evolving the energies that are in us.
I think
hopefully
it's
that's
funny
a little
that you
helpful.
Yeah, no, but like it's funny how you even talk about a C-section. I had C-sections with both children. One, they were both scheduled, but my daughter decided to come early. Still C-section because she was breech, but she came 3 weeks early. So it was kind of like, you can't schedule this, you can't control this. And I kind of look at that with astrology because, and maybe it's my Aries in me, I've wanted to control everything in my life so much. The idea of surrender and letting go has been extremely hard for me. You were talking about Aries being extremely impatient. I want things now. I'm like, can I have Amazon in my life in every single aspect? It's just one of those things.
Yeah.
And so the way I've looked at astrology without really knowing about it is like, this is going to give me the layout of how my life is going to be. But that is not the case, you're saying. It is just a set of parameters for which your soul can work with to experience life as you choose.
Yeah. I think you cannot look and say, this is exactly how it's going to unfold.
Yeah.
You can sometimes look ahead and get a sense of when there are going to be big times of testing, when there are going to be times of fruition. You can get a general feel for that, which is quite lovely. You can look ahead through your whole life. But I do think that part of a journey for all of us is learning to take our hands off the wheel, that grip, that control, and surrender to the greater energies that are at work, but then also to play our part. We're not just like, oh, well, let whatever happens, happens. We also want to know ourselves and show up and play our part. So it is always the in-breath and the out-breath, the surrender and the action, the receptivity and the activity, the yin and the yang. It's all of that. Yeah.
Well, going back to children, now we've talked about like a group consciousness as in the greater world, and we've talked about our own individual astrological beings. Do we have like a family, like makeup with our astrology? Do we have like a family constellation?
That's a beautiful question. You can always look at two charts together, and you can always like blend two charts and learn a lot about the relationship. And what I've also noticed in families is if you go back through several generations, you will notice that there are one or two signs that are predominant. Like in my family, Taurus shows up again and again and again. And so I believe in this family lineage, there's also a working out of particular energies. Like there's almost a family karma. It's like, what are we here as a family to be working on? And you'll also notice when you start to just study even the sun, moon, and rising sign, in every family, there are crazy overlaps between the sun, the moon, and the rising. So your sun might be your daughter's moon. Your moon might be your husband's, rising sign, right? It's like there's always these energetic overlaps. And that alone is fascinating, even for the greatest astrology skeptic. It's like, how is this happening again and again and again, that we are magnetizing these fundamental energies that are core to who we are?
That's fascinating. So would you say it's genetic, or is it just more of like based in the family energy, that karmic, almost like people talk about right now is really popular to talk about is like generational curses, like breaking the generational curse. Is that kind of where that comes in? Or is it like a genetic passing down, do you think?
I don't think it's genetic. I think it's this idea of a group of souls here to work something out together. And I think there are certain lessons and certain expressions that want to come through a particular lineage. So I think it has to do with a community of souls who are on a particular journey together. And there are some families that are here to, learn a fuller expression. There are some that are here to tell their emotional truths at a deeper level. You could explore these themes that come up again and again and again astrologically.
So do you teach others or train others in astrology still, or is it just more coming to you for readings at this point?
No, I do teach, and I have taught for many, many years. And it's interesting you bring up Deborah Silverman, because one of the ways that I love to teach astrology is through embodiment. So in fact, I do these retreats at least twice a year, and we're on our feet learning about the energies. So it's not just a mental exercise. So it's really like, how does it feel to embody the energy of Taurus? How does it feel to embody the energy of Leo? So yeah, from the get-go, I've taught astrology, but I've always combined it with a kind of artistry. So I think I've been teaching for, 20 years. And recently I did a whole series of classes that took us from introductory through advanced. And next year, I'll be doing a year-long journey with just a smaller group of people. But the year-long will combine one-on-one astrology sessions, group writing sessions, group creativity sessions, We're going to spend time with certain poems. We're going to spend time deeply going into each person's chart. So I'm an Aries. I always like to be reinventing the wheel. I always like to try something new. And so this upcoming year will be a little different. And yes, all along, I do see clients as well.
I mean, I really do believe what you're doing is combining that artistry and the astrology together. It really feels like it's a beautiful dance. Like they really do work together, although it seems although they're seemingly separate kind of things, they do work so well together.
I agree with you. And I'm just sort of sitting in this moment and breathing and saying, yeah, like what at the core is it? And I think for me, they both return me to my heart and to myself. And from that place of depth and authenticity, that's where all beauty is created, So they both return me to the center. And they say, they whisper, this is who you are. And they both are empowering to help us take our next steps. Both modalities, both the artistry and the astrology are tools of empowerment.
I mean, that is one of the biggest themes, is coming back to your heart. That's what, in any which way of finding your authentic self, finding who you are, it's all kind of out of your head and into your heart. And so that's beautiful. How do we find you? How do we sign up for your program? How do we follow along in your journey? And where do we get your poetry? I know you have multiple books out there.
Thank you. Instagram, follow Heidi Rose Robbins. And by the way, every day for the last 6 years on Instagram, I've posted what I call a moon note. And it is a kind of my combination of astrology and poetry, in that every day I'm offering an insight into what's going on astrologically, but hopefully written in a more poetic fashion, right? So you can follow me on Instagram, and then HeidiRose.com is my home, and there's all the possibilities there. So I would recommend just going over there. And then I just finished, a book came out this year called here it is, Everyday Radiance. And it's a daily astrology gift of each day. It tells you about the astrology, and it tells you, gives you a sort of prompt or writing prompt or a poem or something. And that you can order anywhere. And there are several other books that you can just find by Googling me.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Heidi. I've really enjoyed this conversation. As you can tell, I'm very fascinated by astrology, and it just scares me a little bit to dive in, but I want to so bad. So I think it's definitely on my Aries to-do list.
I know sometimes people do feel nervous about it, but honestly, when you get into the truth of astrology, there's nothing to fear. There's nothing that's like, there's nothing that is fortune telling. It's only permission, invitation, growth, deepening. So it's a beautiful world, and it's nothing to be scared of. So yes, take an Aries dive and explore it. I highly recommend.
Oh my goodness.
Thank you so much, Courtney. I so appreciate it.
Thank you. And that's it for today's Intentional Living with Courtney Meyers. Thank you so much for joining me. And thank you, Heidi Rose Robbins, for the beautiful discussion all about astrology and poetry, bringing two worlds together that seem so different, but aren't that far apart. Obviously, I am completely fascinated by astrology. It's something that I've been talking about on the podcast and want to learn more about. I hope you enjoyed learning with me. If you want to learn from Heidi, I'll put all the information of how to get in touch with her in the show notes. And as always, you can find Intentional Living with Courtney Meyers and Intentional Media on our website at CourtneyMyers.com. That's where you'll find books, courses, and everything else we're doing. So stay tuned, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.